All right. I'm here with Derek Collison, and he is the founder and CEO of Synadia. How's it going, Derek?
It's going great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to unpack your successes here. But before we get there, let's talk about your background. What got you into business?
Um, so my background started probably when I was 12 or 13. My maternal grandmother got me and my sister Commodore 64s. My sister had no desire to do anything with her, so I used hers for spare parts. But that kind of got me into technology at a very young age in the early 80s. And it was just, it was a great fortune for me to fall into that. I always thought I wanted to be a doctor. You know what I mean? I love what I do, and the technology landscape has only accelerated. And I think the wave we're in right now with AI, which I do believe we're on the path, right, to AGI and super intelligence. I'm just grateful that I get to kind of see it, and be part of it. And so yeah, so I've been doing computers since I was about 12 or 13. So yeah.
Nice. Nice. So what was the first venture? I mean, a lot of people start tinkering with things. Like I was lawn mowing back when I was a teenager. And what was the first venture that you kind of took off with?
Believe it or not, I went to university and got a computer science degree. But back then we were using punch cards and, trying to get access to, timeshare type systems. But at the same time, University of Maryland, which is where I went, um, in my sophomore year, we got an agreement with MIT, and that was awesome, right? So we got access to X10 before it became X11, some of the GNU compilers, all kinds of really interesting stuff. But when I first started with the Commodore 64, it was just games, trying to make pixels light up, just like any kid would way back in the day. But as I was going through university, I got kind of drafted by the Applied Physics Lab of Johns Hopkins University, and did some work there. And then when I graduated, they pulled me into a top secret program for the NRO. So
Nice. Very cool. Okay, so let's talk about the startup story around this venture. And I know there's a lot to unpack
yeah,
around Apcera, but let's talk about kind of the core pieces of how it came to be.
yeah. So I spent the beginning of my career when I first moved to California in 1991, early 91, I guess. Um, I did a healthcare. I didn't, but I was part of a healthcare startup that ultimately went under. That was trying to revolutionize electronic patient records, right, in 1990, 91.
Hmm.
But what was very interesting to me was I immediately got thrown in, and this happened at the Applied Physics Lab was um, horizontal scaling, which everyone takes for granted now. But back in the day, it was kind of like being penalized or having a dunce cap. Because if you were actually with the top physicist in the lab, or if you were the top engineer, you got all access to the supercomputers. And so I got thrown into this notion of distributed computing, and I kind of was like, well, I got to figure this out because somebody wants me to do this, right? I kept running into roadblocks. And so I spent most of the early 90s outside of the healthcare and distributed systems for the financial services industry with a company called Technicron that became TIPCO. And when I left TIPCO, I went to work for a still at the time burgeoning startup that had just kind of gone public called Google. And I got to relearn all of what I thought about distributed systems and what I got wrong. And my time there kind of formed my thought process for when Paul Moritz, who had just taken over for Diane Green at VMware, took over, and he came calling looking for Mark Lukowski, who is a extremely talented senior engineer at Microsoft. Some of the Windows and T stuff is all him. Him and me and another person, the dean, worked at Google, and Paul knew Mark, and so he says, "Hey, I want to bring you guys over." And he essentially just said, "Hey, I want you to come up with something cool." And so what I did was I went away and I came up with Heroku for the enterprise, right, which became Cloud Foundry. We were in a phase where building distributed apps or web apps wasn't crazy hard, but still deploying them was very, very hard, right? So Ruby on Rails on your laptop was kind of the thing at the time. It was easy, but then when you actually went to deploy it out, it was still hard. And so um, I can't remember if the exact dates are right, but Paul was like, you know, come up with an idea, present it to us. And then I did. And they said, great, go with it. And can you have something ready in 3 months? Which we did. We actually had something ready to demo in 60 days. But you could imagine going that fast, right? There was corners that we cut a little bit. And so as Cloud Foundry kind of became pretty popular, but I also didn't know if platform as a service would keep resonating. I realized that there was a bunch of things that I would do very, very differently. And so Apcera, the company that I started, was essentially me trying to do a redo of Cloud Foundry. So better scale, better cross-region, cross-cloud type of compatibility, and a better security story right from the ground up. And so Apcera was built to do that specifically.
Got it. Got it. What a wild trajectory. And I love hearing stories about people that were at Google and sort of spun out. Like there's pretty legendary PMs at Google that spun out to start up in the Bay Area, and I think there's so many great stories there, and I like that yours kind of.
Oh, I mean, we were incredibly lucky. We had a new PM just out of Stanford. He had just kind of created Google Maps, Brett Taylor, and it was very clear early on how special he was, even at such a young age. And obviously that has kind of bared out, as history has gone forward. But yeah, the time at Google was amazing. And it taught me to think very differently about things that I thought I knew how to do. And so, from my perspective, as I'm getting, further along in age and stuff like that, I really try to press myself to make sure that I'm always trying to learn. I'm always trying to be open to new ideas because the landscape, especially now with AI, the landscape is changing so fast that you really have to keep your head up, and be looking around for sure.
Yeah, and I lived in the Bay Area for 5 or 6 years, right down the street from Google in Mountain View, and I had friends that worked there. And for everybody listening, I think that there's an ingredient at companies like Google where just being surrounded by
Hmm.
other individuals, regardless of like what you're directly consuming, just being in the presence of other people
Yep.
that think in these really brilliant ways just makes you inherently smarter and faster, and you learn so much quicker. And it's such a kind of unspoken piece about education and just how valuable that is to starting up eventually to go on. So let's start about the Apcera piece, because
Yep.
you have some big names that backed it initially. Talk about that experience, like going out and raising money.
Well, I think, raising money is you have to have a thick skin, right? So I'm not as famous as the Collison brothers, right? That created Stripe, but a good number of people in Silicon Valley know of me. I've been there quite a long time, since 1991. Um, but that doesn't matter, right? You wait in line just like everyone else. I had people get up right in the middle of a presentation and just walk out. You know what I mean? And so you have to be patient. You have to have a thick skin. But we had some amazing investors, and believe it or not, one of the ones, True Ventures, has invested in every entity I've ever started in every round, and I trust them implicitly. And so when you get one that's really, really good and believes in what you're trying to do and believes in you as a person that can not only come up with the idea, but can then attract other people to get behind the vision and then try to drive that to some sort of meaningful outcome. It's really, really special. But when you're trying to raise money, you know, um, yeah, definitely have a thick skin. And, for the audience who maybe hasn't gone through this on their own, the rules are always changing, but back in the envelope is the C round is all about you, the founder or founders. The A round is where can we test the market? Can you get to an MVP? Can you attract people that actually believe in your vision and will join you on this venture? And then when you move into the B and later rounds, it pretty much switches all to business metrics, right? And so I call the B round the redheaded stepchild of VC rounds, because you could be interacting with a VC that was in the seed round. Let's say you had, pre-seed, seed, maybe one or two a prime type of rounds, and all of a sudden you sit in front of the exact same people who would ask you certain questions, and for the B round, everything changes. They're like, don't care about you anymore, don't care about the MVP, don't care about The fact that you can attract people, it's show us the business metrics. Can you run a business, right? And so, there's goes in fits and spurts. And I think, pardon me, the unwritten rule for Silicon Valley is always be aware of your timing and your leverage. So you get an A, you usually get 18, 24 months. Watch your cash burn, watch what you think you're delivering within that time span, and watch your leverage with both your users, your customers, and of course the VC community, because you don't want to go into a subsequent round and do what's called a down round or a bridge round, if you can. And they happen all the time. It's just Silicon Valley doesn't talk about them.
Hmm.
But what happens is that you aren't leveraged, right? And so the VCs or the private wealth, right? So you can vacillate between private wealth and VC. So VC start to posture a little bit, or if macroeconomic stuff changes, they a lot of times will slow down. You can move to private wealth, family offices, or if you know a bunch of people. Um, but yeah, you definitely want to make sure you understand your leverage and your burn rates and how long you've got and what you want the company to deliver within that time frame to give you that leverage to go into the next round.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. And I think what would be good next is it's a good segue into kind of how the trajectory of Apcera kind of continued on and what happened at the end there for Ericsson and that whole deal. We were talking briefly before we were recording, and I think that this is a really unique story that a lot of people don't really hear transactions like this. So I'd love for you to kind of walk through how the that initially took place
Yeah.
with Ericsson and how it transpired.
Yeah, so back when AppSara was created, I firmly believe that you don't plan on an exit. That you keep your head down and you do the right things, and things, just be aware and ready for opportunities coming at you. Um, and so, the telecommunications industry, um, I really feel that at the time they felt a little bit left on the outside in terms of the big, cloud, wave, right? And so a lot of these providers, whether they were the service providers within country regions, or in our case, kind of a major equipment manufacturer to kind of the whole industry as a whole, they were looking to expand. And Jason Hoffman, who I've known for a long, long time, way back into the Joyent days. He had been tasked with Hans. Hans was the CEO at the time, and now he's the CEO of Verizon, um, to grow markets, right? To expand beyond just being an equipment provider and services provider that Ericsson was. And a natural version of that would be, oh, we should provide compute. But at the time, IaaS as a basic mechanism, pardon me, was looking like it would come up a little bit short. And so they wanted something that more looked like a platform as a service. And they knew about Cloud Foundry and Pivotal and VMware and stuff, but they were really interested in having a closer relationship with the technology. Um, and so we began conversations about what that might look like. And we eventually got to the point where they said, well, pretty much we want to buy you out, but we want you to keep running as an independent company. But we want us to be kind of like the number one customer, right? For building out our strategic initiatives internally that Jason and a bunch of others were running. But Jason was definitely pushing the envelope there. And so that's kind of how that came to be. And so they came, totally, wiped out the cap table, and we started life as a second entity with a very large cash infusion, both in terms of clearing out the cap table, but then operating capital. And so we went from, I think probably 14, 15 people to 150-ish in probably 12 months, you
Whoa.
know, and that, yeah, that's fast, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to control that growth, but they were very adamant about how big they wanted this to be. Um, and so that was kind of that, and Apcera kept going. We had some amazing customers who really believed in what we were trying to do. Um, and then as we got into, I guess it would be year five, maybe year six, five-ish, um, a technology was born to allow fluidity between cloud providers, right? And it was mostly being driven by Diane Green, who we talked about in terms of VMware, but she had been brought on to Google's cloud, right, to kind of really spur that up. And the first thing she was trying to solve, I believe, I'm not speaking on her behalf, was how do we make it just easier and easier to move workloads from other cloud providers to Google? And that tech was Kubernetes, right? And Kubernetes was more of an IaaS based tech, right? And so it wasn't an apples to apples comparison, but at a very, very high level, it was how to deploy and run workloads, right? And so if you blinked or at least squinted, it looked very, very similar. But the kicker is that we charged for our technology and Kubernetes was free, right?
Mhm.
And so for the listeners, if you're driving a business, whether it's open source or not, Apcera was closed source. But if you're in a business where open source is a component and you're trying to drive a business off of it, um, my, my advice is always feel that you have a very, very clear understanding of where the consumer bias is. And what I mean by that is the consumer bias, if it gets driven to zero, meaning that your consumers think that the tech you're building should be free, it's very hard to reverse that. So when we watched that, we watched, our ACV numbers starting to drop. We watched, competitive landscape changing, and it wasn't, oh, Kubernetes is better. It was just, oh, well, Kubernetes is free. Why would I pay you?
Mhm.
Show me that this stuff is so compelling. And even when it was, free, draws a lot of eyeballs and attention. And so after that point in time, I actually flew to Sweden and had an emergency board meeting where I said, look, I think the writing's on the wall. You guys really want this tech. You're our number one customer. Let's just fold everything into Ericsson, you know what I mean, and figure out a transition plan. And so that's kind of what we did towards the end.
Nice. Nice. Yeah, I think that's yeah, it's such a smart way of using like a current on a macro scale, like a current that you see and you
Hmm.
pick up on, and it's looking out for the acquiring company because if it was 6 months from then or a year from then, it was only a matter of time before either they picked up on it or someone else picked up on it
Yep.
and said like, "Hey, this is trending in a way that we're kind of uncomfortable with." So it's a yeah, it was definitely right move and a really good move to go there,
Well,
meet with them.
those moves are always really hard, right? Because
Yeah.
you want things like this. The ideas and the company, the people in the company were amazing individuals, and so, it's a little bittersweet. But I think the role of a CEO or a founder, and in my case, I was both in both that company and in my current company is, um, you don't have a safety net, but you're tasked with making the hard decisions. And if they go well, then everyone benefits. And if they don't go well, it's kind of just lands on your lap and people kind of poke fun at you. But don't ever question that if you want to go into this, that's your job, right? And you have to, with very imperfect information, make decisions and feel confident that you're making the right decision, even though you don't know if it will be or not. And this just felt like one of those ones. So I mean, I just kept watching the data and I was watching it trend. I knew we had a good amount of cash in the bank, but I was like, we're just going to spend this treading water, right? And I was watching Kubernetes start to gain power in the other cloud providers, right? Because they had to like do a Me Too movement, right?
Yeah.
Meaning that it's
Yeah.
like, oh, we can't like just Google do this. We have to do it too,
Hmm.
which was all part of the plan, at least from my perspective, with what Google was trying to do there. Um, and so one weekend, I just really put my head down and looked really, really hard at the numbers. And I said, this just doesn't make any sense. And I think the right thing to do would be to take all the cash in the bank, give it back to Ericsson Mobile, have them fold it completely in, setter the external business, and have it drive the tech with the transition plan, right? Internal to Ericsson. And so that's what we did.
Nice. And let's talk about the transition because it was basically a 10x in terms of like how you hired that quickly. And for everybody listening, going from a under 20 team to over 100 in a year is a fast clip. Like that's that's
Yeah.
like a fundamental cultural change, and it's hard to hold on to the wheel when you're going that
Yeah.
quickly. I think that's important to mention. So, out of those people, did the transition go completely one to one over?
Those types of transitions always have similar optics, which is there's a pile of cash for people that are staying and a pile of cash for people that are going. And they will always usually start very similar. But as the process goes, right, the acquiring company or the company you're being folded into, they care a little bit more about the people that are staying, right, than the people that are going.
Hmm.
And so you'll see some shuffling and moving, and so all of a sudden, the budget started changing around. But in general, I think at the end of the day, we served both audiences, well. I think we did the right thing for Ericsson from my perspective. I'm not speaking on their behalf, but I care deeply about the employees of Apcera and how they fared with the fold in. And so if you weren't going to be part of the fold in, right, reducing duplicative work and things like that, I wanted to make sure that those folks were taken care of as well. And so it was definitely a process, but I think in the end, I was happy with the result. And one of the core technologies that I built originally for Cloud Foundry, is a technology called NATS. It's kind of like a low-level connectivity, data persistence, workload type of a system. But at the time, it was still just mostly connectivity. um, I went to Ericsson and said, hey, it's open source. The NAS part was, but I said, I want to make sure that it's okay if I want to start a company around that, that we're unencumbered to do so. And they were extremely gracious in that and said, yeah, absolutely, no problem. So that's essentially kind of the where we are now with Synadia, which is we're about 7 years into a company wrapped around just that technology and what we call edge native type of platforms.
Nice, nice, and that's a great segue, I think, into after the transition. Did you stick around for a couple of years? What did that look like? And then you kind of jumped out and started your next venture.
Yeah, so on obviously when they did the large strategic investment, Hans flew over and him and I met one early morning in San Francisco, and he says, I just want to make sure that you're all in on this, right? Which is totally a fair question to ask, meaning, you get all this cash because they wiped out the cap table, meaning that the VCs and the early employees that had substantial holdings within the cap table got flushed out. And a lot of times they will try to, do a revest structure or something like that, but they didn't in this case, right? They just incentivized people with, bonus plans and things like that. When we decided to fold it in, the people that were working on the Nats stuff were kind of caught in between. Um, and so I didn't take any break. So I literally, my last day at Ericsson, after I said, hey, we should do this. And for the most part, it was only about, I would say less than 45 days after that, that all of the details have been worked out. We were going back and forth, obviously, on what that might look like. But once that actually closed, I think I took off one day, and then immediately started Synadia because the talent that I wanted to help drive the early formation of that company, they weren't in the stay bucket or the severance go bucket. They were kind of stuck in between, meaning that if they didn't have jobs, they might have to consider other positions, right, and do something to support themselves, their families. Which I'll never give anyone a hard time about that. But I wanted to keep all of those folks, and so we quickly set up Synadia and started, you know, putting people on payroll pretty much instantaneously.
Nice,
Yeah.
nice. That's a
What's nice,
really
but I'm getting tired because I started doing this around 2012, so we're 13 years straight going. But I can tell you that learning stuff every day, and the team that we're working with at Synadia, a lot of the core AppSara folks that were working on the Nats tech came over with us, is still super exciting. So all good, but yeah, it would have been nice to have been able to take a little bit of a breather, I think.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, 13 years straight. That's a long stretch in the trenches of building for sure.
Yeah, and I'm not getting any younger, so it's getting a little harder for me. You know what I mean?
Well, that's a great kind of changing gears into the finale question of knowing what you know now. What would you tell Derek 10 years ago?
For the Apcera use case, it's tough because I think we might have not reacted as fast as we should have, but we reacted pretty fast. to something nobody predicted, right?
Mm.
The release of Kubernetes, and again, because the hyperscalers didn't need to make money off of it, and they wanted it pervasive to grease the skids for workload portability between cloud providers. Um, that's what started driving the consumer bias to zero. So the only thing with Apcera would be two things. Even though the board was pretty adamant to grow so fast, I kept pushing back. I should have been a little bit more adamant that we shouldn't grow that fast. Um, from doing the right thing once we kind of saw the writing on the wall with Kubernetes driving that consumer bias to zero, I feel I did that. Maybe I should have done it a little bit sooner, but I did it pretty quick. I mean, I was watching it pretty closely. From a Synadia standpoint, I think when I started AppSara, not enough pieces were in place to figure out to build a complete company around that versus AppSara, which is a whole platform that kind of looked like Cloud Foundry. Um, and so if I could look back, I would say start your first company earlier, for me at least. You know what I mean? Don't wait so long. I mean, I was starting products inside of companies like at Technicron and Tipco and Google. You have free reign to kind of just take a clean sheet of paper and come up with a cool idea, which I loved. But doing all of the pieces, I should have done that sooner. And I probably should have created Synadia sooner. In other words, really wrapped um, a company around the core tech because I knew what we were trying to do with Synadia and trying to make it a platform. Um, Making a company a platform play is difficult, and there's two choices that people usually make. One is they start with an upper level vertical solution first, and then they try to build a platform out. A lot of times those struggle to make that transition and ultimately fail. But the flip side is that you try to build the platform play out first. So you're very misunderstood. You don't have a tremendous amount of revenue coming in as you're trying to really build this thing out. So you have to have VCs that are patient, and again, for the audience, I think you should always be extremely clear of your expectations. And so for me, I was like, you guys are going to have to be patient. We're going to be misunderstood. We're not going to have business metrics, within 24, 36 months that might resonate. And we did. We were very fortunate to get that. Now we can build out more of the vertical solutions, but we do have a true platform, meaning our customers, when they say, ooh, let's figure out where the boundaries are and where the walls are, they can go a lot further than with other tech, which is good. So, um, but the other thing too, and maybe this is more a philosophical thing, you know, for better or worse, you're a product of all your successes, but also all your failures and all of the hiccups, right?
Mhm.
And so if I had gone back and changed stuff, I probably wouldn't be the person that I am today. Um, and I think all of those lessons kind of build up. And so, you know, always be prepared for opportunity, especially if you're an introvert. For the audience members who feel like and introverts aren't necessarily shy, but sometimes it manifests as that way. It's more of, hey, we need to be by ourselves to recharge. You know, you might say, I don't want to go to that meeting or I don't want to go to that function. But if you lean in and meet new people, it's amazing how, and be prepared for the opportunity. It's amazing how your life can change. I mean, even I wasn't going to go to the function where got reintroduced to. I mean, I knew Jason very well, um, and if I hadn't gone there, AppSara might not have had the exit that it did. Which,
Mhm.
again, for the VCs and for the company, I feel very good about what we pulled off there, right? In terms of the return to the VCs, what we all did from a financial perspective. Um, but yeah, I was close to just saying, no, I just want to stay home tonight. I don't want to do this. And so for the audience, be very clear with your expectations, but be humble in those expectations. Um, Always be looking for opportunity and lean in versus lean
Nice.
back. And it's hard to do that if you're more of an introvert, type stuff. But yeah. And then the only bad decision a CEO can make, in my opinion, is no decision.
Mhm.
So always be trying to make decisions and realize that most people who haven't been in the job might see it as, oh, you're up here. But I can promise you, you're not. You're all the way at the bottom. Because what happens is all the problems are rolling downhill. And what you want is you want to build up a company structure and a culture and a bunch of extremely talented individuals that can kind of stop the ball as it's coming towards you. But
Mm.
eventually stuff gets all the way to you and it's the worst problems and it's the hardest decisions with the least amount of information that could go just totally sideways on you. Um, but you have to realize what you signed up for, and you have to realize that that's the job that you've taken on. And so, yeah, for the audience, it's, lean in, right? And make the hard decisions. And by the way, the hard decisions, you probably mess up lots of them. But that's okay. Keep leaning in, keep keeping your head up, keep watching and go, whoops, that one didn't work out. And at least one of the mantras that I try to go by is that if I truly feel that I made the wrong decision, I want to be the first one to say it. I don't want someone else to have to tell me, hey, that decision that didn't work out very well. That still happens, by the way. We got a lot of smart people that'll tap me on the shoulder and say, I don't think that's going to work. But I try to live my life by saying, if it's the wrong decision, I want to be the first person to realize it, raise my hand and go, yep, that wasn't a good deal. We're going to pivot. We're going to move this way. I own that, but let's move forward.
Well said. I like that. At the bottom with the kind of pinball coming down, and by
Yeah.
the time it reaches you, you have
Yeah.
like very limited information. That's such a beautiful articulation of what it truly means to be at the helm. Well, those are the questions I have for you. The final
Great.
one is knowing or the final one is, where can people learn more about Synadia?
Yeah, Synadia.com or Nats.io or the websites. We have a really vibrant Slack ecosystem.
Hmm.
I think we have over 10,000 people in the Slack channel.
Nice.
And so Nats might be one of the more popular technologies you've never heard of. Yeah, I think we're over 300 million downloads now, but it's starting to accelerate, especially because of our alignment with the renaissance that's going on in manufacturing, connected car, especially EVs, and then AI at the edge, which is a big deal. The tech stack that we've put together lends itself very good to those verticals. And so we're aligned with that trajectory of things moving very, very quickly, which is great. And we love our customer list is kind of a who's who of the global 500 companies in the world, including the very, very top companies. And so we're extremely proud of that. And so, yeah, so if you want to learn anything more about Nats, I think Apcera is now offline. It was online until a couple months ago, I think, still. But I think the Wayback Archive still has it. But Synadia.com and Nats.io for the new stuff.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, wherever you guys are listening on iTunes or Spotify, the links will be in the show notes. But thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom, Derek.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.